Welcome, everybody. If you could just keep your videos off for right now and muted, that would be great. Okay. We're nothing if not prompt. So welcome, everybody. I'll keep letting people in as they come in, but I somehow feel like we've got a lot of things to cover today. So we'll get started here pretty soon. Welcome, everyone. I'm coming to you today from Thompson Rivers University in Kamloops, where it's freaking cold. So I'm super happy to be inside. It's amazingly cold up here. I'm a wimp for sure. Kenn Oldfield is back in Oliver. Paul Rickett is on Bowen Island, and we're going to get this started here pretty soon. If I could just remind everybody to just keep your videos off. It makes it less distracting. Keep your audio muted if you can, and also after our first speaker speaks, which is Kenn, I will be taking any questions that have come in the chat, and then we'll move over to Paul after that, and we'll take some questions after Paul. So if you have any questions, if you can go down to the bottom of your screen, type them in chat whenever you have them. And then when we break, I will go back and scroll through and ask them the questions. So appreciate all you guys joining us. Fortify this year in 2023 will again be in Penticton at the lakeside. We're going to have a night before for the various sectors on the 14th of November, and then the main conference is going to be on the 15th of November. So if you guys can mark your calendars for that, registrations will go on sale at the end of the summer. So all right, so I think we're good. I think what we'll do is we'll just get Kenn to take it away. I'm going to mute myself, and yeah, we'll see how that goes.
Well, thank you, Sandra. I'm just sharing my screen now. And welcome to part one of the cost and markup strategies for today's world. I am doing the first presentation part, and Paul Rickett, as Sandra mentioned, is doing the second part. You're going to see the differences between an engineer's presentation and a marketer's presentation. So you may notice that there's a certain style change after the halftime. Although I'll be using wine as examples, everything that we're going to cover today applies equally to ciders, to beer, to distilled spirits, and cupcakes if you're making them. We are in the business of making a product and selling the product. And that's why markup and costing are very important. In this section, I'm going to be covering pricing strategies to consider and highlight the possible impacts that those would have. And if you have questions, as Sandra said, type them into the chat, and at the end of my presentation, we'll field some. At the end of Paul's, we'll field some, and any that keep coming in. So to get us all on the same page, let's consider your income statement. And whatever business you're in, the most simplified piece of your income statement is revenue, the money you bring in, minus the cost of the goods you're selling, which gives you your gross margin. So in this example, $1,000 in revenue, $550 in cost of goods, gives us a gross margin of $450 or 45%. From that, you get rid of your selling cost, leaving you a net margin. You cover your general and administration, and that leaves you with your profit margin. What we are going to cover, I'm going to focus on today, is those first three lines: the revenue, the cost of goods, and the gross margin. And it's important to understand what is included in your cost of goods sold. So the examples I'm using here are Pinot Gris, and Merlot, which are the two most highly grown white wine and white grape and red grape in BC. The pricing on the grapes I got from the 2021 crop report, and just worked up a simplified model of what the cost of these wines are to make. So for example, in the Pinot Gris, the grapes come in at $3 per bottle. Your harvest processing, I'm guesstimating at $3, which is everything that goes into the ferment, right through to wine ready for bottling, finishing and packaging, which brings an example of Pinot Gris at a $9 a bottle cost of goods. Similarly, Merlot, different process, more expensive grapes, time spent aging in barrels, and come up with a cost of goods of $11.70. So these are numbers that we're going to use in the rest of this analysis. So once you know your cost of goods, then you can consider pricing strategies to determine what your revenue is going to be. So in this case, we're looking at the wholesale price that the LDB calculator uses. And the wholesale price is the pivot point between you and your customer, you and your retailers, and you and your own on-site store. So I'm going to compare three methods of coming up with what your wholesale. And the first method is to use the cost of goods as your prime cost in the BC LDB calculator. And the major benefit of this is it's the most direct treatment of your business into a wholesale price. In a free market, this is probably the method you would use. The con is that the wholesale price or the shelf price might not land where you want it to be. And you don't necessarily make as much of a profit. So the second method is to add a markup to your, or a profit margin to your cost of goods. And this recognizes that the wine production is a profit center and is making you money. It increases your gross margin. The downside is it might inflate your wholesale above what the market tolerance would be, and you end up with an unreasonably high shelf price. And then there's the other method, which is decide what you want the answer to be and figure out what the question is. So do you want a desired shelf price or a desired wholesale price? And you work that back to a prime cost. So the benefit of this is it gives you some control over your shelf price, given that the retailers are free to make their own markups. The con is that it may produce a prime cost that's below your cost of goods, the cost to make the product, and that is not generally a sustainable way to run a business. So using those three methods, worked it through with the Pinot Gris. Yep, changing my slide notes. Okay, and so I'll work this through in each column, and then we'll do the comparison with Merlot without going through the detail. So with the cost of goods of Pinot Gris at $9, that's across the board. Using that as a prime cost, you end up with a BC wholesale of $17.01, which at a 34% markup, which is typical, Paul will go into this more, that ends up with a shelf price of $22.79. And from a revenue, cost of goods, and gross margin point of view, 1701 revenue minus $9 cost of goods gives you $8.01, and the gross margin is 47.1%. So method two, where you apply, I'm using a 20% markup to the price, gives you a prime cost of $10.80, which would generate a BC LDB wholesale of $19.30, and that would give you a shelf price at 34% markup of $25.86. The revenue, cost of goods, gross margin gives you a gross margin of 53.3%. So significantly better than method one, but the downside here is that $25.86 might not be a price that the wine will bear on the shelves. So then method three, I've used a high cost and a lower cost shelf price. And in one case, the prime cost comes down to $9.71. And so that's above what your cost of goods is. And your margin is 49.7%. In the other case, it comes down to a $20, gives you a prime cost of $7.84, which means you're $1.16 below what your cost of goods are. And your profit margin, gross margin, is 39.7%. So Paul's going to talk more about his recommendations and his experiences with the actual numbers on these methods. But the gross margins are reasonable. They line up with what experience shows. And now comparing that with Merlot, same methods, working it through, the shelf prices end up at $27.39 with a gross margin of 42.8%, or 31.37, which gives you a gross margin of 50%, again higher than method one as expected. But the reason these gross margins are not as high as the Pinot Gris is because the liquor board calculator model uses a different markup above a certain threshold on the value of the wine, and Merlot was quite a ways up that. So then method 3A, choosing a $30 shelf price or a $25 shelf price, and again we get margins of 47.7% and 37.2%. And just compare that bottom line with the Pinot Gris. In all cases, the Pinot Gris has a higher gross margin because of that markup model. But in each case, the trend is the same. The method one gives you a middle of the road value. Method two gives you the highest. And then where you choose your shelf price can give you somewhere in between or below. So then gross margin is not the whole story. Understanding your selling costs is important as well. And other than touching on it, this isn't an area that we're going to go into any detail today. It's another talk altogether. But your selling costs are things like warehousing, freight and distribution, the banking and credit card, and any collection fees that are taken out. Sales commissions, if you use an agency. If you have an on-site store, your cost to operate that store is a piece of your selling cost through that store. And advertising and promotion. These are just some of the things that can be included in your selling cost. So that concludes my talk, unless there are questions that have come in.
Let me check. I don't have any questions yet, but feel free, everybody, to write some questions in. And I will pause here for a minute just to see if any come in for Ken on the costing. And while I'm waiting, I'm going to make Paul able to share his screen.
Do you want me to stop sharing?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, hang on a second, Paul. Like you're there. There you are.
Okay. So, no, I'm still showing disabled.
You're good now.
I'm good now? All right. Share screen. Yes, I'm good now. There we are. All right. Can we see that? That is the question.
We can. You're good.
We can. Oh, good, good, good. Now what I do is see what I'm sharing here. Okay. Okay. Morning, everyone. Hope you're not freezing to death up there. It's cold enough down here. Thanks, Ken. My section is about the relationship between markup, wholesale, and selling price, with particular emphasis on what happens when your product goes out beyond the tasting room to those indirect channels. I'm going to use wine as specifics. If you're a cidery, a brewery, the same principles apply throughout. An accurate costing, to Ken's point, is essential for any business. It becomes even more important if you are a BC manufacturer and you're going to sell outside of BC, because they're totally different tax and business models depending on where you're selling. So you really do need to know, and not, I'm going to say, average costs or whatever. You need to be pretty specific about your costing. The scope of the topic we're going to talk about today, or we're talking about today, is so much larger than we have time to really drill into. I could probably spend hours talking about it. So I'm going to show you some data about the industry and show you some particular impacts on markup strategy as it relates to indirect channels, or retail in particular. I'm going to leave you with some points to ponder in setting up price strategy. Now, if this all works, my slide should advance. It does. The picture here is your classic illegible doctor's prescription, which would be, if we were doing this in my handwriting, would be what it looks like. So thank God for computers. I got to stress here that everything I say today is not a prescription. It is a way to think, a framework to think, if you will. Every manufacturer has a different set of influences and decisions that drive their business strategy, which will drive how they price, which method they use to price. And that could be down to a product level within the manufacturer. So these are very, very broad topics. The data you're going to see is drawn from our BI platform, containing soon to be 6 years of detailed analytics at SKU level, extended with all sorts of extra features such as region, price, reputational variables, and so on. The data I'm also showing is only 750ml bottles, which is 95% of what BC Wine sells. Volumes are in 9-litre cases, and it is filtered for independent wineries only. There's no big three data in this set. And in some of the slides, I'm going to demonstrate how things change when different filters are applied. And we'll use Merlot and Pinot Gris as the examples here. If we have time at the end, we can always backtrack to answer any specifics. So here's the general business problem you face. Our poor chap here is balancing on that wholesale pivot in multiple directions on pricing, and with competition, brand positioning, goals, all playing a role in how you set markup, how you set price. Obviously, you can go out there and benchmark against retail prices, if you will, but there's a whole raft of variables we're not going to actually cover that what influence how you set your price. And then, having balanced precariously on this balance ball at the wholesale pivot, you've got the buffeting of market conditions and costs and supply, especially costs and supply these days, coming in to force decisions that you might not otherwise want to make. So it's a really challenging position. If you're a young winery or a young manufacturer selling only direct, it's a bit simpler. But as you scale and have an increasingly complex product mix, it becomes far more complex how you work. So accurate costing is so important. Some varieties, some products within your product range cost more to make than others. So you should be aware of actual costs to avoid accidentally using Kenn's method 3B. In general, I think methods 2 and 3 are the best way to approach things. That's the pick a wholesale price to start with and model it, or pick a retail price to start with and model it. In my opinion, methods 1 and 3B are for exceptional cases, such as product intended for direct sales only and never going into the channel, which would be something like method 1, or going outside of BC, and market penetration strategies, which would be method 3B, when you not be shipping via the GLS at all, and for a limited period of time. But basically, the only thing fixed in this whole picture is the LDB markup calculator as far as BC prices. So the next is an industry composite view. Now, what I'm going to show you on the next screen is interactive. And it essentially says you're one big winery. Okay, so this is the blended average of every independent winery out there. Each of you will vary significantly from this picture and have very good reasons for doing so due to all those factors that don't relate to price. It's changed. The life has changed. Those of you around before 2015 will remember that wine was fixed at a 16% discount. Wholesale was fixed at a 16% discount from winery selling price. That was the equivalent to a 19% markup. It's a lot more complex since then, a lot more flexible. There's a lot of benefits to it too. And it's actually, I believe, the reforms generally have helped the industry. But it is definitely more complex and there's a lot more factors involved. And I'm going to move on to this screen and now tell me if things don't work, but let me explain this screen. It's a dashboard I created from the data. On the right-hand side is the overall blended gross profit margin from prime that the BC industry is achieving before using methods 2 and 3A, which would pull it up, and discounting prime method 3B, and then your direct sales discounts, LTOs, promos, which will pull it down. So there's lots of variables that impact that, but the overall average is coming in around 48% before those. And when Ken and I were talking about this beforehand, my guess we'd come in around 50% at this level, and his was 45, and we're right in the zone. So that blended GPM is achieved by taking a whole raft of different factors. In the square here, does that, oh, it doesn't matter.
I was just going to say really quick, Paul, to remind people, we are recording this, but it does take a little while sometimes to get to you. So if you want to take out your phones and take a picture of the screen, you're obviously welcome to do that while we're in the webinar as well.
Great, thank you. So this box, hopefully that purple cursor is showing up, is the average you would make by selling, a gross profit margin you would make by selling in your different channels through GLS, through wholesale, which is retail and licensees, and direct from the winery, before selling costs, which will always vary. Down here in the bottom is the industry segmentation. This is where your volume goes. For independent wineries, 51% of all the volume going out in 2022, at least to July 2022, goes out direct. And you can see the actual case volumes here. This is about just over 1 million cases. So 500,000 plus cases going out direct. It's the single biggest channel. So this blended takes this segmentation by this value and comes up with the blended margin. Here's our pivot point up here in the highlighted box. 1952 is the average volume weighted wholesale price of a BC 750ml wine. And if those of you at the Fortify presentation on the Monday night last year, that's pretty aligned with that data I put up then. Working backwards, working backwards from that 1952, we end up with a overall prime cost filed for the industry on average of $11.21. Here we have an average volume weighted markup. This is 35%. So Ken's 34%, this is 35%. It will vary by winery, but the average markup's gone up to about 35% from wholesale. And you compare that to the 19% pre-2015, shows you just how dramatically life has changed. And that drives an average per bottle price of $26.41 for the industry. So you've got a whole bunch of things happening here. If you see a little blank box pop up, it'll go away. It's PowerPoint querying the live data set. So if we look at Here on the left here, we have prime by variety. So, and this is as sold. So Merlot going into a red blend would be counted in a red blend. And we go to Merlot. This is Merlot. There's that blank box. So now it changes. This is Merlot sold as a Merlot. So you can see here, 1392, it comes up relatively within Kenn's method 2 and 3 as an overall average. We don't know how much sandbagging has gone in there, but it does suggest that some sandbagging, some method 2 and 3A has been used. The other thing here is that prices are, this is historic data, so prices, the product would have been made beforehand, so you may be filing on historic costs. And I think one of the things to consider when you're setting pricing and considering where you fix prime cost is what you get this year has to fund future years. So the benefit of having some form of contingency in your prime cost calculation is that you're actually driving forward when costs change in future years. So you're producing wine this year, which will not sell for 2 or 3 years in reds. So your costs may have changed by then. You've certainly got storage costs, warehousing costs in the interim. So there's some value, there's some real value in padding that prime cost. Again, here, it's always going to blend. You'll notice how the gross profit margin on the GLS has dropped, and in general, because of that LDB scaling. If we look at Pinot Gris, our calculated prime comes in actually very close to Kenn's $9. Gross margin increases, which is interesting. But you'll find that with whichever way you shape this, and the blend has gone to 49%, we tend to end up in this between 45 and 50% range. Obviously, things change individually. But, and you can see here that Pinot Gris, for instance, a much higher proportion of Pinot Gris goes out through the various channels, GLS, retail, which includes all retailers, all indirect retailers, and direct. So Merlot sells higher. Let's just check that. Merlot, yeah, Merlot actually is sold more directly than Pinot Gris, and this changes with every grape. If I pick Pinot Noir, for instance, we can see our prime moves up to 1534. Blended GPM still stays in the range, but the vast bulk of it is sold directly. So we can cut and slice this data in any way you choose, but it makes some interesting analysis, and there's lots of filters we can apply. For instance, let's go back to Pinot Gris a second. Actually, let's stop that altogether. So we are interacting live here with my database. So I'm going to show one other filter, which is definitely something that when you're setting price strategy you need to be aware of, is what are your peers, say in the sub-region. You might be looking at peers by Merlot, but if we look at sub-region, and I'm just going to pick Naramata. So overall we were 1121 prime, 1952. If I pick Naramata, so this is the wineries in the Naramata bench, they're achieving a higher pivot price for their wines and calculated a higher prime. So logically, their cost may be higher than another region, but logically there may be some padding. Their overall markup actually drops, and the overall price though goes up. So, but they're still at the 49% blended average. And again here, look at the amount of direct sales down in the bottom, 58% going direct. And that's partly a function of its critical mass tourist center. So we can run these whichever way, but to give you some example of how other ways you can look at this in terms of peer pricing. So let's close that filter. Okay, on to the next one. So the next slide here is about retailer markups and the differentials from your winery direct price. I've loaded 4,000 BC retailer prices, including big three wines, and tied them up with winery wholesale where I can. Basically, I've managed to tie up about 65% of independent winery volume to a selection of retailer prices. What I'm going to show you in the next slide is unweighted averages at retail, but it translates very much to what I would expect to experience in real life. And it doesn't mean nothing, none of these things will indicate bad or good, just opportunity maybe. Just for your information, I've been also doing some checking on BC winery prices in Alberta. And obviously you're working from a different basis, it's a different tax base, but the markup from BC Prime, which doesn't necessarily mean much for Alberta, but the markup from BC Prime to their retail averages out about 160%, versus against BC retail 135%. So it is definitely showing a higher cost, a higher price in Alberta. And the markup from BC wholesale, which is irrelevant, is 52% versus a BC volume weighted average of 35%. So again, here, when you're considering strategies, you've got that. And that's why costing has become so important, so you can accurately position your product. Okay, so this is BC retailer data. On the left, these are the anonymized data. Chains, the grocery, the limited, very limited set, LDB, and then individual stores, which I've been able to trace, and the VQA system. So you can see the overall average for retailer markup from your pivot point wholesale is 44%. It varies. As you can see down the bottom, the VQA stores generally a little lower, logically sort of more aligned with winery price. They are not restricted from selling at winery price. I've heard comments about them deep discounting and so on. I don't find a lot of evidence for that, but you'll see that in a second. LDB logically is going to be down there as well, because they typically will sell closer to winery price. But you're going to see some surprising data. The other thing about LDB is their BCL Select prices are marked up significantly higher than their overall average. And that could be because you're bidding to get into the program with a lower price, or they are marking up the price beyond what you would normally sell that at the winery direct. So, but you can see there's a range. And we're going to show this, model this range a little bit for you. But I'm going to explain the next graph. The y-axis, the vertical axis, is your markup from wholesale to your published winery direct price. Again, here we're not dealing with a complete data set. So you have from 0, I'm selling direct at wholesale value, all the way to 100%. I've eliminated some outliers that are above and below that. On the bottom, the x-axis is the differential between the retailer's markup of that from wholesale and your winery direct price. Essentially what that means is, if you look at the 0, when the data points show up, it means the retailers are selling at the same price as winery, which is actually a good thing, certainly from my experience, a beneficial thing. And as they move to the right, they're adding a premium. And as they move to the left, they're discounting from winery direct price. And it's going to show an interesting pattern. Don't worry about the dots for the moment, but this is about 1,277 dots in here. There's a very interesting trend. The pattern shows that as winery direct price from wholesale goes up, so the more you mark it up at direct, the more the retailers are going to discount from winery direct. So they're essentially underselling. Conversely, the lower the margin you offer out the gate between winery direct and wholesale, they're going to add premium. Now, premium is what they've typically always done. In the days of 16%, we were still marking up well above winery price and complaining about wineries competing. So this trend here is quite illuminative. I'm going to give you a couple of examples, but I want to show you a pattern here. The pattern remains almost very consistent with no matter what channel I pick. So if I pick this VQA1, you see the pattern remains the same. They undersell in some cases, and they oversell in others. So what you're doing with your markup strategy is impacting what they do at retail and possibly impacting what sales and how sales happen. Now, I don't consider retail underselling a bad thing. In fact, I think it's probably more beneficial than selling at a premium. It is where most people shop most of the time. So if you can sell them at the winery when they come to visit, and then they can find it less expensive, I know that's a disincentive to buying direct, but then they have the convenience of getting it locally. And secondly, because retailers mark up or mark down, your shelf positioning, if you offer a very low discount, means that you're positioning your product in a disadvantageous way against other competing products. So setting that markup, especially when you go when you're going indirect, is really important. If we look at LDB, the pattern remains the same. And if we take any store, let's pick one with a large number of data points, the pattern remains the same. So the pattern is absolutely universal. Let's pick a chain with, and this represents a significant amount of BC wine sales. Again, it'll vary by store. Each store has its own policies, not yours. They're going to execute their market strategy against their local competition, against where they want to be positioned. So they're executing their own profit strategy, which is independent of what you say. The interesting thing here is that retailers in general sell far more wine where you provide a distance between wholesale and your winery direct price of greater than 30%. Bear in mind the industry average is 35 average, than they do if you discount or have a very low markup. There are very good reasons why you might have a low markup. You want to restrict supply. You don't have a lot of it to allocate, or you don't even want them buying it. So it's not a bad thing. But just so you know that markup does incent the retailers to buy. Excessive markup might incent them. It's a strategy. But at the end of the day, they might actually be selling at less than your winery price, which is not necessarily something you, significantly less than your winery price, which is not necessarily something you want to happen. The other thing here with licensees, they are generally unaffected because they have huge markups. But equally, the closer their glass of your wine in the restaurant is to the value of the bottle, the better. You know, I find it tough when I go in and say I'm paying $12 a glass for a wine that costs $30 at retail. So there's actually benefits in moving your price up. But this offers, let's just click out of here, put the big pattern back in. There's a couple of other examples. You see down here where retailers are really marking up because they get low discounts or the low gap between winery price and wholesale. There's a couple of dots in here which I looked at, and they're not clients, but literally if they raise their winery price, they would add tens of thousands, likely add tens of thousands of dollars to their top line because the retailers are selling at a much higher price than their direct price from the winery and getting a much higher volume. So it's going to depend on your channel strategy. But there is opportunity here to maximize, and in an era when every dollar counts, maximize your pricing. And if I go on to this, so it offers two strategies for you to consider, and it's going to vary with every winery and every circumstance, is if you have a very high markup, you have the potential maybe to increase your wholesale price, which is a good thing. Without really impacting what the retailer is going to sell at. Conversely, if you have a very low markup and retail's doing really well with the product or the brand, you might actually be able to find ways to sell your direct prices at an increased price, which is actually really directly beneficial to you. So this is one of the reasons why I don't actually like starting in modeling price with a retail, especially when you've got some proof out there from past sales about how retailers are selling it. If your brand can sell for a higher price at retail, then you should be able to sell it for a higher price at the winery. Which brings me on to the next slide. Markup and on-site and direct sales. Tasting room dynamics are totally different than those experienced at retail. When someone's in your tasting room, you're getting 100% attention from them, essentially. And you should always be striving for maximum price there, because that sets the benchmark for what's going to happen out in retail. The question is, are you the Gucci store or the manufacturer's outlet? It should be a premium. The winery experience has value. Retail pricing is not regulated. You can change your pricing by the minute, hour, day, if you really choose. That's just that. But you can offer deals. You could have happy days, buy on Tuesdays and get a discount on 3 bottles, for instance. So there's lots of things you can do that makes you same practices as a retailer might do. And it's a way to test your prices, because what you're hearing at the winery can be a very limited subset of what's happening out in the big wide world of licensees and retailers. And in fact, can be misleading even. Leanne and I had a quick conversation on a different topic, but here is an instance where I believe that tasting room feedback has misled a winery into its strategy, or potentially has. Theoretically, you can price your products, so you price your wholesale so it's the same as retail, as your winery retail. It's really not a good practice, because you don't know when you might need or want to sell to another channel, even if you only ever intended to sell this product directly. You can't sell below registered wholesale. So what happens if you suddenly want to sell to a retailer, as opposed to a retailer wanting to buy? You have to go through the process of filing a new price with LDB, which takes time and so on. So it's always a good practice to build in a level of markup into your wholesale pricing. It still doesn't mean you have to sell at that wholesale price to a retailer or a licensee, but it gives you the option there without having to change your price structure. And I think this is really important, that I reiterate, the dynamics are very different to what's happening in a tasting room to when a customer goes into a retail store and is confronted with thousands of different products. How are we doing on time? Good, we're getting there. Points to ponder. And this applies to whether you're a beer, brewery, or cidery, meadery, anything, spirits. In this day and age, every dollar counts. So if you can find $1 even in price difference at wholesale or retail, that you should be taking. And I firmly believe that most wineries can find places in their product line that they could increase their direct winery price by $1 or more, depending on the product, across the board. Every time you set a price, because of the system in BC, it's going to be a compromise. It's impacted by all the external factors. If I change my price at retail, at winery by, let's say, $5, I better do some risk analysis to see what impact I might expect. And that's all part and parcel of the prime modeling price. Building profit into prime gives better margin on sales to GLS, but bumps wholesale. Consider varying the approach by product, tier, or brand. A lot of you have multiple tiers. They don't have to be the same. You shouldn't say, oh my God, I always mark up by 28%. That's what I do. It can vary substantially depending on what your business goals are. High markups from wholesale are an incentive for retail and licensees, which is a good thing, but you can use LTOs to drive more markup rather than just building it straight into the whole picture. Retail underselling is definitely not bad news for the winery, in my opinion. If you go a low markup, if you're only selling direct, it's not a problem because you're going to capture all that between winery direct price and your actual cost. So it's not, the pro is it maximizes the profit at the wholesale level, and the cons, it might deter retailers and licensees from your product and can create competitive disadvantage in their retail operations. So these are things, lots of things to consider. So this poor chap with the chest set here, who's sitting here because he knows that every move he makes will have a knock-on effect. So there's an iterative cycle that has to go on. And with 10:45, one last slide. Thank you very much. I'm Paul Rickett, VARketing. Most of you know me. I have a website, www.varketing.net. You can subscribe to that for free and deliver what I post there to your inbox, but you're welcome to go and have a look. For those of you who remember, I did a BC Wine 2020 report, a big 60-page report with comprehensive data analytics on BC industry, trends and so on. We're going to re-release a 2022 report, preferably, hopefully in April, $449, and there's an early bird price if you sign up and commit and pay by the end of this month, February, for $350. And the release cycle here is going to be a little different than the past report. It's going to come in the format where you'll get the data in PowerPoints and commentary text in a PDF, so that you can put it up, look at the data and look at the comments, rather than reading all the data crammed into the text. And it'll be released in chapters. They'll come fairly fast, but it'll come in sections. Excellent. Thank you very much for your time. I hope that's given you something to think about, and happy to take any questions.
Yeah, Paul, Al's wanting to know with your data, for example, you gave that example with Naramata pricing versus the total pricing,
Yep.
whether or not you can get, if you think that Naramata, for example, is getting better pricing due to the reputation of their sub GI or the volume traffic that they get on the bench, or is that just something you can't really tell from your data?
Well, yes, you can't tell directly. However, consistently, I think in the 2020 report, I made this specific comment. Naramata sort of represents the perfect cluster in technical terms. We have centers of excellence. So Vancouver does really well in high tech because there's a lot of high tech companies here. You've got Microsoft and big players and so on. So there's a lot of resources available. Naramata, because of its proximity of its wineries, concentration, its reputation, regardless of whether the grapes come from South Okanagan, it's the Naramata wineries themselves have a reputation. So there is definitely reputational value contributing to this, in my opinion. There are some other factors. I don't think their costs necessarily are higher or lower overall. Obviously, cost is driven by your longevity. If you're a large-scale winery that's been in business for 30 years, your costs are probably lower than someone who started up 2 years ago buying with current land prices and so on. So there's a combination of factors, but I actually do think Naramata in particular benefits from its regional reputation, and that existed before there was a sub-GI. That's, that just recognized the reality of the world.
So it's not a question on there, but I have a question for Ken. Given what's going on right now with respect to margin squeeze based on higher costs of all kinds of inputs to making a product, how frequently do you think a business should be looking at its margin analysis and its costs? I mean, in the past, it used to be looked at it maybe yearly, but I have clients now that are looking at it quarterly and monthly. And what's your thoughts on that?
Definitely at least quarterly. Monthly would be better. It's not something you want to be looking at in the rearview mirror after your accountant has given you back your year-end financials. The time to act is when you first identify that typically people are looking at the revenue, they're looking at the profit, and they're not analyzing the gross margin and the net margin. And if you're looking at those on a monthly basis, you can see that your cost of goods is higher than what you anticipated it was going to be. And then you can do something about that. Same with your selling cost. You can react if you look in more frequently.
Yeah. Okay. Are there other questions? I know that, I will let you guys know that we are recording this and we do try and send it out. It just takes a little bit of time to compress it and to export the name. So if you won't get it necessarily in the next 1 to 2 days, but hopefully you'll get it very soon after that. So we're trying to get better at it. Sorry about that. Do we have other questions from people? So Jan's asking, how do you see price sensitivity of the BC consumer changing in the next year, this year and next year?
Oh, that's a really good question. There's no really good answer to that. If we're all living in straitened economic times, there will be price sensitivity for sure. But I think I'm a little hesitant. Alcohol in general is regarded as a recession-resistant business. So from a retail point of view, if they go into a store, they may have less money to spend, but if they're in the winery, they're probably there and they're on holiday and they're in I can spend more mode. So I think that they're going to be less price sensitive or could be less price sensitive at the winery level, which is another reason to keep the winery prices, winery direct prices sort of higher on the higher side, and allow the retailers to undersell to keep you competitive in the everyday side. The 1%, there's an awful lot of wealth in BC. You know, it's driven by real estate, unless there's a collapse there. I don't think it'll impact high-end wine prices or volume that much. Really, where these things will happen is at the lower end, and BC doesn't play at the lower end. As those of you who've seen my presentation of Fortify, is we really don't play in the volume low price segment. So there'll be sensitivity, but I don't think it's unless some things go really off the rails economically, that it's going to be as critical as it will be for other areas. That's just an opinion, though. I could be 100% wrong.
All right. Well, there's no other questions coming in.
Sandra, could I make one comment on Kenn's?
Sure.
I totally agree with him. You've got to review all these things far more frequently than you do.
Ken, while you're talking, can you unshare your screen and then in case Ken has to bring it? I know there was a few people that missed Ken's presentation at the beginning, but
okay.
Yeah.
I'm now a host again.
Yeah, you can unshare anytime you want.
Oh yes, I can. Hang on. Uh-oh.
It's okay. Go ahead.
No, I've got it. There we are. I think one of the important things that Kenn mentioned and is, I mean, your costs for producing a product come out of harvest and bottling, let's say. So you know those pretty quickly, unless you have. So padding prime to reflect future bottle costs makes eminent sense. I do think you need to monitor on a much more frequent basis, that could be monthly, is your selling costs, especially your tasting room costs. Because again, here, if your tasting room costs, your volumes, your tourist volume drops off or whatever, that's could be a trigger point where you really need to think about revising your direct pricing.
Yeah.
Back to you.
Agreed. Agreed. Okay, I think that's it. In the meantime, if we have any issues with the recording, we will go ahead and send out the PowerPoint presentations to everybody. So you'll at least have that and the contacts for everybody. So if anybody on here wants to see some topics like this and in the next couple months, we have the ability to do these webinars on a fairly regular basis. If not, if no comments come in, I'm always looking for comments for content for the conference in November. So just throw me an email and hopefully we can make it be a really engaging conference this year on the 14th and 15th of November. So thanks everybody for joining us, and we will see you later.